debt, you might want to pay attention for the next few minutes because here in the United States, student loan debt has reached a new record high. There are about 45 million borrowers who altogether owe nearly 1.7 trillion in student loan debt. That's trillion with a T. Student debt is now the second highest consumer debt category, second only to mortgage debt, meaning people owe more in student loans than in car loans or even in credit cards. Earlier this year, some progressive Democrats put pressure on the Biden administration to cancel up to $50,000 in student debt through executive action. Senators Chuck Schumer, Bob Menendez, and Elizabeth Warren, they pushed for this in the most recent COVID-19 relief bill that would make loan forgiveness tax-free through 2025. They say this is an important first step in forgiving student loans, but so far, President Biden has not been persuaded to cancel the full $50K.
I do think that in this moment of economic pain and strain, that we should be eliminating interest on the debts that are accumulated, $10,000 debt, but not 50.
Now, what some people may not realize is that the U.S. already has student debt forgiveness programs, but the problem is very few people actually benefit from them. Since 1995, the U.S. has offered income-driven repayment plans, or IDR, that allow federal loan borrowers to pay a percentage of their income toward their loans each month, under the promise that the remaining balance will be forgiven after 20 to 25 years. But very few people actually get that forgiveness. According to data from the National Consumer Law Center, of the roughly 2 million borrowers in America who have relied on federal income-driven repayment plans, only 32 people have received total cancellation on their remaining balances. And that is just the tip of the iceberg. We're going to bring in an expert now on this student debt crisis, Seth Frotman, who is the executive director of the Student Borrower Protection Center. Seth, thank you so much for being with us today. This is pretty insane, just me reading off these numbers. But I mean, how did we get here? Why aren't more people in this program getting their student loan debt canceled after making so many years of making those, monthly payments?
Well, thank you so much for having me on. The lead-in was just great at setting up the problem. Again, there's now more than $1.7 trillion of student loan debt. 45 million Americans get a student loan bill each and every month. And as you covered, Congress looked around at ever-increasing balances and tried to put in place protections to help borrowers, to provide protections to ensure that people didn't spend decades drowning in debt, to protect dedicated public servants who were giving back to their community, to ensure that people who are ripped off by predatory schools wouldn't be left holding the bag. And what we see, unfortunately, time and time again, is that these programs have failed to deliver relief. You covered the 32 borrowers out of millions who are still drowning in debt decades later. Only 2% of public servants who have applied have gotten public service loan forgiveness. Hundreds of thousands of people ripped off by predatory schools are still in limbo, trying to get relief. And I think this is one of the underappreciated aspects of the student debt crisis, is how many people needlessly and unwarrantedly get a student loan bill each and every month where that debt should have been repaid, it should have been forgiven under these existing programs.
Okay, so what's the solution here?
Well, I think that's what's really interesting and important, is that Congress has passed these laws. These laws are on the books. And the Department of Education, the Biden administration, has all the tools at their disposal to try to fix these programs and provide relief. And the number one thing that I've heard from borrowers is, we don't need another complicated program to layer on top of the last one. No more Rube Goldberg type schemes. We just need the government to fulfill its promise to public servants, to people ripped off by their schools, and as you highlighted, people who've been drowning in debt for decades.
Does this also impact borrowers of color and more from the low-income backgrounds?
That's exactly right. I think the student debt crisis is obviously broad and impacting huge swaths of the American economy and American families. But the people who are bearing the brunt of the student debt crisis are the exact same folks and communities who are on the front lines of the fallout of the COVID pandemic. And we see how student debt is driving income inequality, racial inequality. We see how it's hampering asset accumulation or trying to close the racial wealth gap. And that's why these issues are more than just about, an individual borrower's student loan bill or how much is on their account. The fallout of the student debt crisis is impacting our communities, our states, and our country. And if we're not going to solve the student debt crisis, if we're not going to fix these programs, it's going to be very hard making progress towards keeping the promises of both closing the racial wealth gap, driving down income inequality. And that's why tackling the student debt crisis is so vital to these larger goals.
So the situation at hand here is you got millions of students in this program, but not all of them are getting that promise fulfilled that their student debt will be forgiven after 25 years. So what's the reality? What can they do right now if they're in that situation? Is there anything they can do?
So it's a great question. I think one of the things to flag is that often this is reported as if borrowers made mistakes. They might have, missed a form here or there. And none of that is true. We have seen now a litany of lawsuits, of regulators, of government auditors, all document how we are in the mess we are in because of government mismanagement of these programs across administration and widespread malfeasance and illegal practices by the student loan industry, where student loan companies actually drove borrowers into plans that ensured they weren't eligible, knocked them off track from getting relief. And this is why DC really needs to act, because individual borrowers can only do so much. And now is the time for the government to keep its promise to public service loan forgiveness, keep its promise to all of these borrowers you mentioned who were promised that they wouldn't have to spend decades in debt. And I think the most important thing for the Biden administration is to have the political will to fulfill these promises to borrowers, not to put them back into another overly complex program or to create another type structure that we know is going to fail, but really step up with the authorities they have and deliver relief to people whose only real fault is taking on debt to try to get a better life for them and their family, to chase the American dream like we all want to do. And this can have a meaningful impact and really help millions of people.
Exactly. Very good point there, Seth. And now our only hope is that lawmakers in Congress can watch this interview and learn from it and actually do some action in tackling the student debt crisis.